An emperor's own army stopped on a mountain road and refused to take another step. They had already killed her cousin. Now, they wanted her. And the most powerful man in the world stood there and gave the order to strangle the woman he loved. And then they made him look at her body to prove she was dead. Number 10. She was called the Lady of the Sun, and the story that follows her through 600 years of history is that she stole the rings off a dead king's fingers. Her name was Alice Perrers, and in the 1360s, she did something almost impossible for a woman of her time. She started somewhere near the bottom. The accounts are contradictory, but the least flattering ones say she was the daughter of a tiler or of a laborer, and even the more generous versions put her in the minor gentry at best. And she ended up the most powerful woman in England. She got there by working as a lady of the bedchamber to Queen Philippa, the wife of King Edward III, which means she was employed to serve the Queen in the Queen's own rooms. And while she was doing that job, she began sleeping with the Queen's husband. Edward III was one of the great warrior kings of English history, the man who started the 100 Years' War, who won at Crécy, who founded the Order of the Garter. He'd been married to Philippa for decades and had a reputation as a devoted husband. And then, in his 50s, his eyesight failing and his grip loosening, he fell for a woman in his wife's household who was perhaps 20 years old. They kept it quiet while Philippa lived. When the Queen died in 1369, Alice stopped hiding, and what happened next made her one of the most hated women in medieval England. Because Alice Perrers understood something a lot of royal mistresses never worked out. Affection is temporary, but property is forever. So she took everything she could get, as fast as she could get it. She accumulated manors and estates across England, dozens of them by some counts. She was granted jewels out of the royal treasury in quantities that historians have valued at the equivalent of millions of pounds in modern money. And in the single detail that most enraged the court, she asked Edward for the late Queen Philippa's personal jewelry collection, her dead employer's jewels. He gave them to her, and she wore them openly at court in front of everyone who had served the woman they'd belonged to. Then in 1375, the king held a great tournament at Smithfield in London, and he paraded Alice through the streets in a chariot, dressed in gold, and presented her to the public as the Lady of the Sun, the mistress, crowned as a spectacle in front of the whole city. But it wasn't the jewels or the pageantry that broke her. It was the courts. Alice worked out that if you have the king's ear, people will pay for it. So she started interfering in legal cases, showing up at the courts, pressing judges, pleading in cases she had no business being anywhere near, securing verdicts for friends and for anyone willing to pay for her help. She was, in effect, selling justice. And she did it so brazenly that in 1376, the English Parliament, the body known to history as the Good Parliament, turned its full attention on her. They accused her of an enormous list of misdeeds. One chronicler wrote that she had utterly overstepped the bounds of womanly conduct, that she had forgotten her own sex and her own weakness, besieging the king's justices and stationing herself among the doctors in the ecclesiastical courts, unafraid to plead her own cause and make illegal demands. And Parliament's response tells you how much they hated her. They didn't just banish Alice Perrers. They passed a measure forbidding all women from practicing in the law courts. Every woman in England lost a right because of one royal mistress. She was banished. And then she came straight back, because the king's son, John of Gaunt, was effectively running the country and undid the whole thing, and Alice returned to Edward's side. Now here is the story that made her infamous forever. In June of 1377, Edward III lay dying, an old man felled by a stroke, and Alice was at his bedside. And according to Thomas Walsingham, a chronicler at St. Albans who despised her, what she did in that room was monstrous. He wrote that she distracted the dying king from confessing his sins, because his greatest sin was her. And then, when he was dead or nearly dead, She pulled the rings from his fingers and left, stripping the jewelry off her lover's corpse while it was still warm. That is the image that has followed Alice Perrers for 6.5 centuries. But here's the honest complication, and it matters. If the account says Alice was alone with him when he died, then how does anyone know what she did? She was never charged with it, and there's a competing version in which a priest burst into the chamber to warn Edward he was dying and needed to repent. And Edward, hearing this, ordered Alice out of the room and confessed his sins properly, which conveniently restored the king's reputation for piety at the end by making him the man who finally rejected his wicked mistress. Both stories can't be true. One of them was almost certainly written to make a woman into a monster so that a king could die a saint. What we do know is what happened after. Alice was tried by the peers of the realm and banished again. Her lands and property were stripped away. She spent the rest of her life, over 20 more years, grinding through lawsuits, fighting to claw back the estates that had been taken from her, dying in 1400 with a fraction of what she'd once held. The great poets of the age took shots at her. Chaucer and Langland both wrote about the greedy woman at the heart of the court. She became the standing English example of what happens when a king lets a woman too close to power. Alice Perrers took from a kingdom. The next woman on our list gave one away and became so beloved for it that people still tell the story of what she shouted out of a carriage window. Number 9. In 1681, an angry mob in Oxford surrounded a carriage, believing that the woman inside was the king's hated Catholic French mistress. They were ready to turn violent, and the woman leaned out of the window and shouted at them, "Good people, be civil. I am the Protestant whore." The crowd burst out laughing and let her go. That was Nell Gwyn, and she's on this list for a reason that will become clear. Because in a video about women who destroyed kingdoms, Nell is the one who arguably saved a bit of one. She came from absolutely nothing. Born around 1650, probably in a slum, possibly in Hereford or in a grim alley in London. Her father was likely a broken-down soldier who died in a debtor's prison. Her mother ran a bawdy house, a brothel, and later drowned in a pond, reportedly drunk. Nell's early jobs, by her own cheerful account, included serving strong waters to customers in that brothel. Then, she became an orange girl. That was a real job in Restoration London. Young women stood in the pit of the theater selling oranges to the audience, flirting with the gentlemen, carrying messages between the men in the seats and the actresses backstage. It was one small step above the street, and from that pit, Nell Gwyn climbed onto the stage itself. This was a brand new thing. Women had only just been permitted to act in English theater, and Nell turned out to be genuinely, extraordinarily funny. She became one of the great comic actresses of her age, famous for delivering saucy prologues and for a comic timing that people wrote about for decades, which is how she caught the eye of King Charles II. Charles was the merriest and most notorious monarch England ever had. He'd been restored to the throne in 1660 after years of exile, after his own father was beheaded, and he ruled with an appetite for pleasure that his enemies never stopped complaining about. He had a wife, Catherine of Braganza, who never gave him a living child. And he had mistresses, many of them simultaneously, openly. Nell was never the grandest of them. She was never made a duchess in her own right. She had no interest in politics, held no salon, meddled in no policy. What she had was that she was funny and she was honest, and she never once pretended to be something she wasn't. That's what made her a public phenomenon, because Charles's other mistresses were despised. The most hated was Louise de Querouaille, French, Catholic, widely believed to be an agent of Louis XIV, showered with a duchy and enormous sums of money that English taxpayers were funding. In a country that had recently fought a civil war, partly over religion, having a French Catholic woman whispering to the king was politically explosive, and Nell, the Protestant girl from the gutter who never hid where she came from, became the people's favorite by contrast. When that Oxford mob mistook her carriage for Louise's, her line about being the Protestant whore didn't just save her from a beating. It became one of the most repeated jokes in England because it captured exactly why the public loved her. She was in on the joke about herself. She gave Charles 2 sons, and there's a famous story about how she got the elder one a title. Supposedly, with the king visiting, Nell called to the boy, "Come here, you little bastard." Charles objected to the language, and Nell replied that she had no other name to call him by, since the king had never given him one. Shortly afterward, the boy became the Earl of Burford, and later the Duke of St. Albans, a dukedom that exists to this day. Charles II died in 1685, and on his deathbed, that famously careless king reportedly asked his brother to look after her. Let not poor Nellie starve. His brother did for a while, but Nell only outlived Charles by 2 years. She died in 1687, at around 37, and she left money in her will for the poor prisoners of her old neighborhood and for a weekly payment to the poor of the parish. So why is she in a video about mistresses who destroyed kingdoms? Because Nell Gwyn is the control group. She had exactly the same access to a king as every other woman on this list. She simply never reached for the levers, and it's the only reason her story ends with a joke instead of a scaffold. The next woman reached for every lever there was, and for 12 years, she effectively ran France. Number 8. Imagine being a king's mistress and signing official state documents with the king, not separately, but jointly. Your 2 names fused together on the paperwork of a nation. That was Diane de Poitiers. And here's the part people find hard to believe. She was 20 years older than the king she controlled. Diane was born in 1499 into the French nobility, and she was married off at 15 to a man nearly 40 years her senior. She was widowed in her early 30s, and she wore black and white mourning colors for the rest of her life, which, in one of history's better pieces of personal branding, became her trademark look. The boy who would become Henry II of France entered her life under horrifying circumstances. When Henry was about 7 years old, he and his older brother were handed over to Spain as hostages, exchanged for their captured father. 2 small boys shipped to a foreign country, imprisoned in harsh conditions for years, essentially as collateral. Henry came back to France at around 11, withdrawn, damaged, silent. And the story goes that on the day he was sent away, Diane de Poitiers, a grown woman at court, kissed the frightened little boy goodbye. Whatever the truth of that scene, by the time Henry was in his teens, he was devoted to her, and by around 19, he had made her his mistress. She was 39, and the relationship lasted until the day he died. Now, Henry had a wife, and not just any wife. He was married to Catherine de Medici from the great Florentine banking dynasty, one of the most formidable political operators of the entire 16th century. And Diane humiliated her constantly in ways that are almost hard to comprehend. When Henry became king in 1547, he gave Diane the Château de Chenonceau, the beautiful castle arching over the river, one of the most coveted properties in France, a property Catherine wanted desperately for herself. He gave Diane crown jewels. He gave her the title Duchess of Valentinois. And when official documents went out, they were signed with a merged signature combining his name and hers, the 2 of them on the paperwork of the Kingdom of France as a unit. He even wore her colors, black and white, her widow's palette on the King of France at tournaments. His monogram was designed to interlace with hers. In the decoration of royal palaces, her emblems were carved into the stone alongside his. The Queen, meanwhile, was ignored for years and failed to produce children for a decade. And here is the detail that says everything about the balance of power in that court. Diane, the mistress, was the one who pushed Henry to sleep with his wife, because the dynasty needed heirs, and Diane understood that a queen who never produced a son might be replaced by a younger, more dangerous rival. She managed the king's marriage like an administrator. She would send him to Catherine's bed and then have him come back to her. Catherine eventually bore 10 children, and every one of them arrived under the supervision, effectively, of her husband's mistress. Diane's power lasted 12 years, and it ended in a single afternoon in July of 1559. Henry was celebrating a royal wedding with a tournament, and, characteristically, he was wearing Diane's black and white. He rode a final joust against a young captain of his Scottish Guard. The lances met. His opponent's lance shattered, and a long splinter of wood drove through the king's visor and into his eye, and on into his brain. He took 10 days to die, in agony. And in those 10 days, Catherine de Medici finally got to be queen. She barred Diane from the king's sick room. The woman who had been the most important person in Henry's life for 20 years was not allowed to see him, was not permitted to say goodbye, and was not present when he died. Then Catherine sent for her and demanded the crown jewels back, and she demanded Chenonceau, the castle Diane had been given, the one Catherine had always wanted, and forced an exchange, taking the beautiful river chateau and handing Diane a lesser property in return. Diane was banished from court. She lived out her remaining years quietly on her own estates and died in 1566 at 66. And what killed her is the strangest part of her whole story, and we only found out in the last 20 years. Diane's most famous quality, the thing everyone wrote about, was that she did not seem to age. A contemporary who met her 6 months before her death claimed she still looked 30 when she was more than twice that. Her skin was famously, luminously pale. People whispered it was witchcraft, a rumor that could genuinely have gotten her burned, and which is part of why she needed a royal protector in the first place. The real explanation was that she was drinking gold. 16th century alchemists held that gold was the perfect, incorruptible element. It never tarnished, never decayed, and reasoned that if you consumed it, some of that permanence might transfer to you. Potable gold was the luxury anti-aging treatment of the age. And Diane, a woman 20 years older than her royal lover, whose entire position depended on remaining beautiful, took a daily dose of gold chloride dissolved in solvent for years. It did give her the pale complexion. It gave it to her by causing anemia. In 2009, her remains were exhumed and analyzed. Her original tomb had been broken open during the French Revolution, and her body dumped in a pit outside the chateau walls. So it took DNA matching against preserved locks of her hair, plus a healed fracture in a leg bone that matched a riding accident she'd had at 64 to confirm it was her. Her hair contained roughly 500 times the normal level of gold. Her bones were fragile and thinned. Her hair was brittle. The researchers published their findings in the British Medical Journal and concluded she had most likely died of chronic gold poisoning. She had spent decades slowly killing herself to stay beautiful for a man who was already dead. 12 years signing the documents of France. 10 days of a dying king, and it was all gone. And a grave broken open by a revolution 2 centuries later, so that we could finally read what she'd been putting in her body to hold on to him. Now, Diane at least kept her life. The next woman on our list took a whole kingdom down with her, and she did it in 18 months, and she wasn't even who she claimed to be. Number 7. In 1846, a dancer arrived in Munich claiming to be a Spanish noblewoman named Lola Montez. She was neither Spanish nor noble. She was an Irish woman named Eliza Gilbert from County Sligo. And within 2 years, this fraud would end a 23-year reign and force a king to abdicate. Lola's whole life was an act. She'd been born in Ireland around 1821 spent part of her childhood in India, made a disastrous early marriage, and then reinvented herself completely. New name, new nationality, new backstory, and launched a career as a Spanish dancer. She was not, by most accounts, a very good dancer. Her signature piece was something called the spider dance, in which she pretended to shake spiders out of her skirts, lifting them higher and higher, and reportedly high enough for audiences to see she was wearing nothing underneath. Whatever it lacked technically, it worked commercially. She turned up in Munich and got herself an audience with King Ludwig I of Bavaria within about 3 days. Ludwig was 60 years old. He was a serious man in many ways, a genuine patron of the arts who rebuilt Munich into a neoclassical showpiece, earning it the nickname the New Athens. He was also obsessed with female beauty. He had commissioned a whole gallery of beauties, dozens of portraits of attractive women hanging in his palace. And there's a story about their first meeting that may well be invented, but has never stopped being told. Ludwig, looking at her figure, is said to have gestured and asked whether it was nature or art. And Lola's answer was to take something sharp and cut open the front of her dress in front of the King of Bavaria so he could judge for himself. Whether that happened or not, he was gone within days. What followed was one of the fastest, most complete collapses of royal judgment in European history. Ludwig wrote her poems and letters. He built her an opulent villa in Munich. He gave her an enormous income. He made her Countess of Landsfeld. And the money he spent on her was so extravagant that his expenditure on this one woman is reported to have exceeded the cost of building one of Munich's landmark public monuments. A king spent more on his girlfriend than on a national building. He also pushed through her naturalization as a Bavarian citizen over furious resistance. And when his own interior minister objected, that minister was gone. And then Lola made her fatal mistake. She started using her influence on politics. Bavaria in the 1840s was a conservative Catholic state, and Lola began pushing Ludwig toward liberal reforms, partly, it seems, out of genuine conviction, partly out of spite for the conservative establishment that despised her. So now she wasn't just a scandal. She was a political faction. Munich divided into pro-Lola and anti-Lola camps. She had a group of student supporters who called themselves the Alemannia, and they brawled in the streets with students who hated her. In early 1848, with revolution breaking out across Europe, the University of Munich became the flashpoint. When members of Lola's student faction walked into a lecture hall, the other students walked out. In February, a riot broke out, and Lola's supporters had to be barricaded inside a coffee house. Ludwig's response was to close the University of Munich entirely and order all students out of the city within 3 days. It was catastrophic. He hadn't just angered students. He'd angered every landlord, every barkeeper, every shopkeeper in Munich whose living depended on those students. The city erupted. Crowds raided the armory and moved on the royal palace. His entire cabinet resigned. His own family turned against him. He was forced to reverse the university order and to banish Lola. She left, and then she defied the ban and came back to Munich anyway, and the unrest flared all over again. And that was it. Ludwig was compelled to sign a proclamation making huge concessions toward constitutional monarchy. And rather than rule as a limited king, on the 20th of March, 1848, he abdicated in favor of his son. 23 years on the throne, ended by a dancer from Sligo with a fake accent. Lola fled the country, by some accounts disguised as a peasant. Her later life was pure chaos. Another marriage that collapsed into a bigamy suit when it turned out her earlier husband was still alive. A husband who vanished under murky circumstances, a move to America, the spider dance in New York and San Francisco and New Orleans, a tour of Australia, another marriage, another divorce. She ended up in New York giving lectures, and in her final years, she worked with destitute women in the city. She died in 1861, around 40 years old. She had wrecked a monarchy and moved on within the year. Now, the next woman on our list did something almost nobody in this story managed. She held on to a king for the rest of his life, kept the goodwill of his wife, and left a bloodline that reaches directly into the British royal family today. Number 6. When King Edward VII lay dying in 1910, his wife Queen Alexandra did something extraordinary. She sent for the king's mistress and brought her to his bedside so she could say goodbye. That mistress was Alice Keppel, and if the name sounds vaguely familiar, it should. She was the great-grandmother of Camilla, the current queen of the United Kingdom. A century after Alice, her descendant married the future king. History has a sense of humor. Alice Keppel was born in 1868, the youngest of 9 children of a Scottish admiral. She married George Keppel, a good-looking army officer from an aristocratic family with a serious problem: no money. They were socially magnificent and financially desperate. She met Bertie, the Prince of Wales, the future Edward VII, in 1898, when she was 29 and he was 56. And she became, for the last 12 years of his life, the most important woman in it. Edward VII had spent nearly 60 years waiting to become king, while his mother, Queen Victoria, refused to die and refused to give him anything to do. In that time, he built a reputation as the greatest playboy in Europe. Enormous appetites, endless affairs, a stomach that entered rooms before he did. Alice was different from the others, and everyone around them noticed why. She was discreet where his other lovers were showy. She was politically shrewd, but never publicly meddlesome. She was warm and funny and genuinely liked. And critically, she went out of her way to be respectful to Queen Alexandra rather than competing with her. The result was that she was accepted in a way royal mistresses almost never are. She was invited to country house weekends with the king, with her husband's full knowledge and cooperation, which is its own quiet scandal, because George Keppel's willingness to look the other way is a large part of how the family stayed afloat. The arrangement brought the Keppels connections, money through investment tips from the king's financier friends, and a social position they could never otherwise have afforded. Alice used her access carefully. Politicians and courtiers went through her to get to Edward. She was known for being able to soothe him when he was in a rage. She was, in effect, an unofficial member of the royal household. And when the end came in May 1910, Queen Alexandra, who had endured her husband's infidelities for decades, sent for Alice and led her into the room. That is an act of almost unbelievable grace, and also a measure of just how thoroughly Alice Keppel had managed to make herself acceptable. But the moment Edward died, the protection evaporated. The new king, George V, was a very different and a much more austere man, and the Keppels were quietly frozen out. Alice took her family abroad for a couple of years while the temperature dropped. She never had the same standing again, and there's a final twist that makes her story land. Alice Keppel's daughter Violet grew up to have a famous, tempestuous love affair with the writer Vida Sackville-West, one of the great scandals of the interwar literary world. Alice, who had spent her life keeping her own affair perfectly managed and invisible, was reportedly appalled at the recklessness of it. Then, generations later, Alice's great-granddaughter Camilla began a relationship with Prince Charles, the heir to the throne. It ran through decades of scandal, a national tragedy, and the most watched royal soap opera in history. And it ended with Camilla crowned queen in Westminster Abbey. The Mistresses' bloodline came back and took the throne outright. So, Alice Keppel is the one who got away with it. The next woman had almost exactly the same job, in almost exactly the same position, one country over. And she died screaming on a scaffold. Number 5. In December 1793, A 50-year-old woman was dragged through the streets of Paris toward the guillotine, and unlike almost every other victim of the terror, she did not go quietly. She collapsed in the cart. She screamed at the crowd for help. She begged the executioner at the very last second for one more moment. Her name was Jeanne Bécu, and she had been Madame du Barry, the last official mistress of Louis XV of France. Her beginning was as low as it gets. She was born in 1743, illegitimate, the daughter of a seamstress with a father who may have been a friar. Her mother's protector took them to Paris, and then, when Jeanne was in her teens, the money stopped and they were on the street. She worked as a shop assistant, a hairdresser's companion, whatever came. And then she was taken up by a man named Jean-Baptiste du Barry, a nobleman who was, in plain terms, a professional procurer. He installed her in his house and used her to attract wealthy and powerful men. That's where she was spotted for the king. Louis XV was in his late 50s, and Madame de Pompadour, who we'll come to shortly, had died. The king needed a new official mistress, and the position of maîtresse en titre was a genuine court appointment with rooms at Versailles and a rank just behind the queen's. But there was a rule. To be presented at court, you had to have a title. Jeanne didn't have one, and she couldn't marry her procurer because he was already married. So he had her marry his younger brother instead, a marriage of pure convenience, to a man she barely knew, purely to acquire a countess's name. And with that paperwork done, in 1769, a woman who had been working in a brothel a few years earlier was formally presented at the court of France. Versailles was appalled. The aristocracy could tolerate a mistress. What it could not tolerate was this one's origins. And her greatest enemy arrived a few years later in the form of a teenage Austrian princess, Marie Antoinette, married to the king's grandson, who considered du Barry beneath contempt and refused to speak to her at all. This became a genuine diplomatic incident. Court etiquette held that a lower-ranking person couldn't address a higher one first, so du Barry could not speak to Marie Antoinette, and Marie Antoinette simply would not speak to her. The standoff went on for over a year, pulling in ambassadors, the Austrian empress, and the king himself. It ended on New Year's Day 1772, when Marie Antoinette finally walked over and said one sentence to her, something about there being a lot of people at Versailles that day. 7 words to end a diplomatic crisis. Du Barry's reign lasted until Louis died of smallpox in 1774, and then, immediately, she was exiled from court and shut up in a convent, before eventually being allowed to live quietly at her chateau outside Paris. She might have survived the revolution entirely if she'd stayed quiet. She didn't. Her jewels were stolen in 1791, and she made several trips to London chasing them, where she was seen meeting with exiled French aristocrats, which put her on the radar of the revolutionary authorities as a suspected counter-revolutionary funneling money to émigrés. Then came a scene of pure horror. Her lover at the time, the Duke of Brissac, was caught by a mob during the September massacres and torn apart. And the mob brought his severed head to her house and threw it at her feet. She still went back to France, chasing an inheritance, convinced she wasn't in danger. She was denounced in 1793, and the person who denounced her was a member of her own household. A servant named Zamor, a young Bengali man who had been brought to France as a child, effectively given to her as a gift, raised in her house as a kind of exotic pet for the amusement of the court. He had grown up, absorbed the ideas of the revolution, and turned on the woman who had owned him. That is the whole rotten logic of the Ancien regime collapsing in a single relationship. She was tried and convicted, and there's a final wretched detail. While imprisoned, she tried to buy her life by revealing where she had hidden her treasure. The guards took the information and executed her anyway. And then she died badly, in the eyes of everyone watching. Aristocrats going to the guillotine were expected to be composed. That was the whole performance, dying with dignity to shame the mob. Du Barry, who was not an aristocrat and never pretended otherwise, was terrified and made no attempt to hide it. She cried out that they were going to hurt her and asked why. She screamed for mercy. Her last recorded words were a plea to the executioner for one more moment. And here's the strange, sad postscript. Contemporaries said her death disturbed the crowd more than the noble ones did. Watching a genuinely frightened woman beg for her life was harder to enjoy than watching a countess sneer at the blade. There's a real argument that Madame du Barry's undignified, human, ordinary terror on that scaffold did more to turn Paris against the terror than 100 aristocratic performances of courage. She was buried in the Madeleine Cemetery, close to Marie Antoinette, the woman who had refused to speak to her, who had gone to the same blade 7 weeks earlier. Now, du Barry was blamed for being vulgar. The woman she replaced was blamed for something far bigger. She was blamed for losing an empire. Number 4. She was the daughter of a man who fled the country over a financial scandal. She was a commoner in a court obsessed with blood, and she ended up functioning as the effective Prime Minister of France. Her name was Jeanne Antoinette Poisson, and Poisson means fish, which the aristocracy never let her forget. History knows her as Madame de Pompadour. There's a story that when she was a little girl, a fortune teller looked at her and predicted she would one day be the love of a king. Her family apparently took it seriously enough to educate her for it. She was trained in music, acting, drawing, and conversation to a standard far beyond her station. She was married off at 20 to a wealthy financier, and she used that position to build a salon that attracted the best minds in France, including Voltaire. And then, in 1745, she engineered, or fate delivered, depending on which version you like, a meeting with Louis XV at a masked ball. Within months, she was installed at Versailles as the king's official mistress and given the title Marquise de Pompadour. What made Pompadour different from every other woman on this list is what happened after the affair ended. Because it did end. Their physical relationship petered out after about 5 years. Pompadour's health was never good, and by most accounts, she had little natural appetite for that side of things. In a normal court story, that's the moment she gets replaced and forgotten. Instead, she made herself indispensable in an entirely different way. She stopped being the king's lover and became his closest advisor, his companion, and effectively his chief of staff. And she held that position for another 14 years, until she died. Louis XV was intelligent, but chronically bored, indecisive, and prone to black moods. Pompadour managed him. She controlled access. If you wanted to see the king, you often had to go through her. She appointed and removed ministers. She corresponded with generals. Foreign diplomats, including the Austrian statesman Kaunitz, approached her directly to conduct serious negotiations because everyone understood where the real influence sat. And she used that power to do something genuinely enormous. She helped engineer the reversal of alliances. For centuries, France's great enemy had been Austria, the Habsburgs. It was the fixed point of European politics. And in 1756, France flipped and allied with Austria instead. Pompadour was deeply involved in bringing this about, and her protégé Choiseul was the man who executed it. On paper, it was a bold piece of statecraft. In practice, it helped drag France into the 7 Years' War, the first genuinely global conflict fought in Europe, North America, India, and at sea. And France lost catastrophically. Frederick the Great of Prussia repeatedly crushed the French and Austrian armies. The British drove the French out of Canada. The British took French possessions in India. When the war ended in 1763, France had lost the bulk of its overseas empire, and the cost had blown a hole in the treasury that had to be filled with taxation. Taxation which is one of the direct threads running toward the French Revolution 26 years later. And all of it was laid at the door of one woman. She became, by many accounts, the most hated person in France. There was a whole underground genre of vicious pamphlets and songs about her, She was mocked for her birth, for her fish name, for supposedly using sex to steal power that wasn't hers. Courtiers campaigned openly for the king to throw her out. He never did. The truth is more complicated and worth saying plainly. She was a convenient target. The strategic decisions were made by men. The king, his ministers, his generals, and the battles were lost by incompetent commanders. Blaming a woman for the loss of Canada was easier than admitting the French state and army were badly run. But there's also no doubt she was genuinely, deeply involved in the politics that led there. Both things are true. She also left a real legacy that has nothing to do with war. She was one of the great patrons in European history. She backed the Sèvres porcelain works, which Louis made a royal factory in 1753. She was behind the founding of the École Militaire, the military academy that would eventually educate a young Corsican named Napoleon Bonaparte. She built the Petit Trianon. She protected and funded writers and philosophers, including Voltaire and the Encyclopédie Project. The fish merchant's daughter shaped French culture for a century. She died at Versailles in April 1764, at 42, probably of tuberculosis, worn out and depressed by the war and its aftermath. The king watched her funeral procession leave from a palace window in the rain and reportedly said only that she'd have better weather for her journey. He was not permitted by protocol to attend. Pompadour cost France an empire. The next woman cost Britain a king, and very nearly a great deal more. Number 3. In December 1936, the King of the United Kingdom went on the radio and told the world he could not do his job without the help and support of the woman he loved. Then he gave up the throne of the largest empire on earth. Wallis Simpson was an American from Baltimore. She was not a beauty by the standards of the day. She was not rich. She was not aristocratic, and, the detail that made everything impossible, she had one living ex-husband and was working on divorcing a second. Edward VIII had been king for less than a year. He'd been the golden boy of the British Empire in the 1920s, handsome, fashionable, the most photographed man alive. And he had become completely dependent on Wallis in a way people around him found unsettling rather than romantic. The constitutional problem was airtight. The king is supreme governor of the Church of England, and in 1936, the church would not remarry divorced people whose former spouses were still living. The government would not accept her as queen. A compromise was floated, a morganatic marriage, where she'd be his wife, but never queen, and the government rejected it too. So on the 11th of December, 1936, he signed the abdication. His younger brother, a shy man with a debilitating stammer who had never wanted the job and reportedly wept about it, became King George VI. Edward was made Duke of Windsor and shipped out of the country. They married in France in 1937, and here the fairy tale falls apart fast. His own family never forgave him. His brother, the new king, granted Edward the style of Royal Highness, and specifically, pointedly withheld it from Wallis. She would never be Her Royal Highness. It was a deliberate, permanent insult, and Edward spent the rest of his life furiously fighting his own family over it, and never won. They lived out decades in a kind of gilded exile, mostly in France, with nothing to do. Perfect clothes, perfect dinner parties, no purpose. And historians who've worked through the private papers have made a strong case that the great love story was largely one-sided, that Wallis had enjoyed being the mistress of a king and had never wanted to be the wife of an unemployed ex-king with nowhere to go. And then it gets genuinely dark. In October 1937, months after the wedding and against the explicit objections of the British government, the Duke and Duchess toured Nazi Germany. They met senior Nazi officials. There are photographs of the former King of England reviewing German troops and visiting Hitler's retreat. When war came, British and American intelligence took his sympathies seriously enough that memos on the subject reached President Roosevelt. Captured German documents later revealed that the Nazis had worked on a scheme involving him. the idea being that if Britain were forced into a peace settlement, Edward could be restored to the throne as a compliant, pro-German king with Wallis as his queen, a puppet monarch in the country that had exiled him. The British government considered the risk real enough that in 1940 they packed him off across the Atlantic, appointing him governor of the Bahamas, a small colonial post that historians have described bluntly as a way to get him as far from German hands as possible. And after the war, when historians wanted to publish those captured German telegrams, Winston Churchill personally tried to bury them. As Prime Minister in 1953, he wrote to President Eisenhower asking him to delay publication for another decade or two. Whether Edward was an active traitor or just a vain, resentful man who let dangerous people flatter him is still argued. But look at the outcome. The abdication that looked like a disaster in 1936 removed a man with Nazi sympathies from the British throne on the eve of the Second World War and replaced him with his dutiful brother, who stayed in bombed London through the Blitz, and whose daughter became Elizabeth II and reigned for 70 years. Wallis Simpson is on this list as the mistress who cost a king his crown. But history's verdict has a sting in it. She may have accidentally saved the British monarchy by taking the wrong man off the throne at exactly the right moment. Now, every woman so far either lost her position, her property, or her life. The next one lost her head, after changing the religion of an entire country. Number 2. In May 1536, a woman knelt on a scaffold at the Tower of London. She had been Queen of England for 3 years. Her husband had torn his country out of the Catholic Church to marry her. And now he had imported a specialist swordsman from France because he'd decided a sword was cleaner than an axe. Anne Boleyn is the most consequential mistress in English history, and the reason is simple. She refused to be a mistress. She'd grown up partly at the French court, and she came back to England around 1522 with a polish and a sharpness that made her stand out. Henry VIII noticed her in the mid-1520s, and Henry, at that point, had a well-established pattern. He'd already had an affair with Anne's own sister Mary, who'd been his mistress and had been quietly set aside. Anne watched what happened to her sister and drew a conclusion. When the king came after her, she said no. Not no forever. No, not like that. She held out for years, historians generally reckon somewhere around 7, refusing to become another discarded royal mistress, while making it clear that marriage was a different conversation. His surviving love letters to her are almost painful to read. The most powerful man in England, increasingly desperate, writing to a woman who kept him at arm's length. And Henry had a problem that made her refusal catastrophically effective. He was married to Catherine of Aragon, who had given him a daughter but no surviving son, and he had convinced himself the marriage was cursed. He wanted an annulment from the Pope. The Pope refused, partly on the merits, largely because Catherine of Aragon's nephew was the Holy Roman Emperor, whose troops had recently sacked Rome and who effectively controlled the Pope's freedom of movement. So Henry did something no English king had ever done. If Rome wouldn't give him what he wanted, he'd stop being subject to Rome. Across the early 1530s, England broke from the Catholic Church. The king declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. 1,000 years of religious authority severed, and what followed included the dissolution of the monasteries, the seizure of enormous church wealth, executions of those who refused the oath, and a religious upheaval that ran through the reigns of Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth and shaped Britain permanently. All of it downstream of a woman who wouldn't sleep with the king unless he married her. They married in early 1533. She was crowned queen, and in September she gave birth. It was a girl, Elizabeth. Henry was bitterly disappointed, and Anne's position, built entirely on the promise of a son, started cracking immediately. She miscarried at least twice more. And Anne was not an easy consort. She was clever, opinionated, sharp-tongued, and she made enemies with real speed, including Thomas Cromwell, the most dangerous administrator in England. By early 1536, Henry's eye had already moved to Jane Seymour, one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting, and the machinery turned. The charges against her were monstrous and almost certainly fabricated: adultery with multiple men, conspiracy against the king, and incest with her own brother George. 5 men were accused, including a court musician who reportedly confessed under duress. All of them were convicted. All were executed. Anne was tried in the Tower before a jury of peers that included her own uncle, and among the judges was the father of the woman about to replace her. She was found guilty and condemned. Henry's single gesture of what he apparently considered mercy was the manner of it. Instead of the axe, clumsy, often needing several blows, he sent to Calais for a swordsman, an expert who could do it in one stroke. The executioner was paid a substantial fee for the journey. On the 19th of May, 1536, Anne Boleyn climbed to the scaffold and made a short, careful speech. She did not protest her innocence. Protesting would have endangered her daughter, and instead spoke of the king as a good and gentle prince. It was, in the coldest possible way, a final act of protection for Elizabeth. Then she knelt, and the swordsman reportedly called out for his sword to distract her into turning her head, and it was over in a single stroke. There had been no coffin prepared. Her body was put into an old arrow chest and buried in the chapel at the Tower. Henry married Jane Seymour within about 2 weeks, and here is the ending that history wrote instead. The daughter, the disappointing girl, the reason none of it had worked, became Elizabeth I. She ruled England for 44 years, defeated the Spanish Armada, and presided over the age of Shakespeare. The mistress who broke England from Rome was executed as a traitor, and her child became the greatest monarch the country ever had. Which brings us, finally, to number 1. Because every woman on this list was blamed for damaging a kingdom. Only one of them is blamed for the deaths of what may have been tens of millions of people. Number 1. She was so beautiful that Chinese tradition ranks her among the 4 great beauties of all history, and the story goes that flowers were said to wilt in shame when she walked past them. Her name was Yang Guifei, and she is the reason the Chinese Golden Age ended. Start with what the Tang dynasty was in the early 700s, because the scale matters. This was arguably the most advanced, sophisticated, cosmopolitan civilization on the planet. Its capital, Chang'an, was the largest city in the world, an enormous cosmopolitan metropolis full of traders and monks and diplomats from across Asia. It was the age of China's greatest poetry, and presiding over it was Emperor Xuanzong, whose long reign is remembered as the height of the whole era. He was, for decades, a genuinely capable and hard-working ruler. Then, in his late 50s, he saw young Yuhuan. And here's the first uncomfortable detail. She was already married to his son. She was the wife of one of the emperor's own princes. Xuanzong took her anyway. The mechanics were handled with a fig leaf of propriety. She was made to become a Taoist nun for a period, which technically dissolved her existing marriage. And then she re-emerged and entered the emperor's household, and his son was given a different wife as compensation. She became Guifei, the highest rank of imperial consort below the empress. He was around 60. She was in her early 20s. And the emperor, who had governed diligently for decades, simply stopped. The great Tang poet Bai Juyi later wrote the definitive account of it in the Song of Everlasting Regret, describing an emperor who neglected the world from that moment on and lavished all his time on her. That though there were 3,000 beautiful women in the palace, all his gifts went to one person. The court was reorganized around her pleasure. Her sisters were ennobled, and critically, her family was elevated into real power. Above all, her cousin, Yang Guifei, who rose to become chief minister of the empire, running the government, and who was by most accounts arrogant, corrupt, and deeply incompetent. And then there are the lychees. Yang Guifei loved fresh lychees. The problem is that lychees grow in the far south of China, and they spoil within a few days of picking, and the imperial capital was hundreds and hundreds of miles north. So the emperor solved it the way an absolute ruler solves things. He put the imperial courier system, the network of fast horses and relay stations built to carry urgent military intelligence across the empire, to work carrying fruit. Riders galloped in relay, day and night, changing horses at station after station, running them to exhaustion, so that one woman in the palace could eat lychees that still tasted fresh. Accounts describe horses and even riders dying on the road. The Tang poet Du Mu wrote a famous few lines about it a century later. The image of a rider coming in through the palace gates in a cloud of red dust, and the consort smiling, and nobody in the world knowing that all this was for a delivery of lychees. It became the single most quoted symbol in Chinese history of an empire's machinery being turned to serve one person's pleasure. The system built to warn China of invasion was being used to deliver dessert. Meanwhile, there was a general named En Lushan. En Lushan was a military commander of non-Chinese origin, enormously fat, famously coarse, and skilled at making the imperial couple laugh. He charmed his way deep into their favor, and in one of the strangest details in Chinese history, Yang Guifei formally adopted him as her son. There are accounts of a bizarre court ceremony in which this enormous grown general was wrapped in oversized baby clothes and carried about as a joke for the amusement of the palace. And while everyone was laughing, the emperor gave him command of 3 military regions in the north, an enormous army, something like 160,000 men concentrated in one man's hands. Then En Lushan and Yang Guozhong, the consort's cousin, fell into a bitter rivalry. Guozhong warned the emperor repeatedly that En Lushan was planning treason. En Lushan, watching a corrupt chief minister position himself as his enemy with the emperor's ear, concluded he had to move first. In December of 755, he revolted. What followed is one of the most destructive events in human history. The En Lushan rebellion tore through the Tang Empire for 8 years. Cities were sacked, villages burned, famine spread nationwide, and the state simply came apart. The most cited figure is staggering. Roughly a third of the empire's population, out of something like 50 million people, disappeared from the tax registers. Historians argue fiercely over how much of that is actual death versus administrative collapse and displacement, and the honest answer is that nobody knows. But by any reading, it was a catastrophe on a scale the world had rarely seen, and the Tang dynasty never recovered its former power. And for our story, the crucial moment came early, in 756, when En Lushan's forces were closing in on the capital and the emperor fled south with his court and his guard. They stopped at a place called Mawei, a courier station on the road, and the imperial guard mutinied. These were the emperor's own soldiers, and they had decided who was responsible for the disaster: the Yang family. They killed the chief minister, Yang Guozhong. They killed 2 of Yang Guifei's sisters. And then they stopped and refused to march another step and told the emperor of China that they would not move until his consort was dead. He refused. Then he argued. And then he understood that he had no army unless he agreed, and that if he didn't, they would probably kill him too. So the most powerful man on earth gave the order. Yang Guifei was taken aside to a Buddhist shrine by the road in most accounts, and she was strangled. Some versions say by the emperor's chief eunuch, Gao Lishi, who had served him for decades. Some say she hanged herself with a silk cord at his direction. She was 37. And then, because soldiers in a mutiny do not take a man's word for it, her body was brought out and shown to the troops so they could confirm she was dead. They marched on. Xuanzong reached safety and within months was pushed aside and forced to abdicate in favor of his son. He spent his final years in the palace as a retired emperor with no power, writing poetry about his grief and his regret. The great cosmopolitan capital was looted. The Golden Age was over. China's center of power was permanently weakened, and the Tang limped on for another century and a half as a shadow of itself before finally collapsing. Bai Juyi's poem about them, written about 50 years later, became one of the most beloved works in the Chinese language. The story of an emperor who traded the world for a woman and then had to give the order to kill her. And it's worth ending on the honest reckoning, because it applies to this entire list. Yang Guifei did not command the armies. She did not appoint her cousin to run the empire. The emperor did. She did not give An Lushan 160,000 soldiers. The emperor did. She did not neglect the government of China for years. The emperor did. She was a young woman taken from her husband by a man 40 years her senior who had absolute power over her. And when it all went wrong, an army decided she was the reason and made her lover strangle her by the side of a road. Which is the pattern, isn't it? Look back at the 10 of them. Alice Perers, stripped of everything and dying in lawsuits. Diane de Poitiers, banished the moment her king stopped breathing. Lola Montez, running for the border in disguise. Madame du Barry, screaming on the scaffold. Anne Boleyn, in an arrow chest. Yang Guifei, strangled at a roadside station so an army would agree to keep walking. And the men? Edward III died a king. Henry II of France died in a bed of a wound taken at a party. Ludwig lived another 20 years and kept his art collection. Louis XV died of smallpox on his throne, having outlived both women who took the blame for his reign. Henry VIII killed Anne and married again within a fortnight, and died King of England with the church he'd built in his own name. Emperor Xuanzong wrote sad poems about the woman he'd ordered killed. Every one of these women was accused of destroying a kingdom. Not one of them ever held a title that gave her the power to do it. They had no crowns, no armies, no legal authority, no right to a vote or a voice. The only thing any of them ever had was the ear of a man who had all of those things and used them badly. That's what a royal mistress actually was, the most visible person in the room, standing next to the most powerful one. And when the wars were lost and the treasury was empty and the mob came looking for someone to blame, everyone knew exactly which of those two people it was safe to blame. They were never the ones who destroyed the kingdoms. They were just the ones who paid for it.